Hello and welcome back to part 2 of the female reproductive system. So in this particular video I want to talk about hormones that control the reproductive system. We want to talk about the menstrual cycle. I would like to talk about sexually transmitted infections and then birth control methods. So hormones secreted by the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, and the ovaries are going to control female reproduction and development of the female secondary sexual characteristics. So at about age 10, the hypothalamus will begin to secrete more gonadotropin-releasing hormone. Gonadotropin-releasing hormone is a really important hormone because it's going to stimulate the anterior pituitary to produce luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. So at puberty, these hormones, the ovaries are going to synthesize estrogens in response to follicle-stimulating hormone. And estrogens are a really powerful female hormone because they are going to be responsible for the female's development of secondary sexual characteristics. Those would include things like breast development, increase in adipose tissue deposition throughout the body, and then increased vascularization of the skin. The ovaries also secrete progesterone, and this is going to trigger uterine changes during the menstrual cycle, as you'll see in a chart that I'll show you in a second. All right, one of the hard things for anatomy students to learn, in my opinion, is the menstrual cycle. So, you know, it's going to be one of these things where you're going to need to pause the video, look at the chart, really intensely study this particular chart that I'm going to show you in the next slide. But the menstrual cycle is characterized by monthly changes in the uterine lining that lead eventually to menstrual flow as the endometrium of the uterus is shed. A menstrual cycle is started by follicle-stimulating hormone, and this is going to stimulate the maturation of a follicle in the ovary. Follicular cells that surround the developing oocyte secrete estrogens. So estrogens are really powerful and important hormone. This is responsible for maintaining secondary sexual characteristics, and it also aids in thickening the uterine lining. Remember back that the endometrium, the inner lining of the uterus, is going to be where the embryo implants itself. So there are secretory glands there that aid in producing chemicals that will allow the embryo to survive. So the thickening of that lining means that the secretory portion is increasing in size. Ovulation is going to be triggered by a mid-surge of luteinizing hormone. And following ovulation, follicular cells will turn into a glandular corpus luteum that will secrete increasing amounts of estrogen and progesterone. If pregnancy does not occur, the corpus luteum is going to degenerate. It'll become the corpus albicans. Hormone levels will decline, and the uterine lining will disintegrate and shed. All right, now here is the chart that you'll need to be able to know and understand. So you can kind of look at it as kind of like two cycles. They're superimposed on each other on this graph. So kind of like the x-axis represents days. You can see down here days. And this is about a 28-day cycle. It depends on the female, though, as to how long it will be. Now, if I look at this graph, I kind of look at it as several superimposed things going on. So in this particular portion down here, it shows you what's happening in the ovary, the cortex of the ovary. What's happening to the follicles? How are they developing? So you have developing follicles here, mature follicles, you have ovulation, corpus luteum development, and then finally the regression of the corpus luteum and the corpus albicans. Okay, so that's kind of like the ovarian cycle or the ovarian events that occur in this 28-day cycle. If you look at the bottom graph, or the most bottom chart down here, this shows you the what happens or occurs at the beginning of the menstrual cycle. So menstruation or the shedding, and then you get the thickening of the functionalis layer of the uterus as your hormones stimulate the cells there to divide and to develop into these glands. Okay, so this is kind of like the uterine part of the menstrual cycle. And then superimposed on that, you have hormones. So you have what's happening to estrogen and progesterone during the 28-day cycle. You can see estrogens increase and then slope down, and then they increase again and then fall off. And then progesterone gradually increases until that corpus luteum begins to degrade, and then it drops off at the end of the cycle. Okay, and then also you have the hormones, luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, and it shows you what's occurring there. It increases, spikes, and then goes back down, and then gradually goes to an increase. Luteinizing hormone kind of increases, levels off, mid-surge cycle, and then it levels off after that. Okay, so that's kind of what's occurring there during in terms of the hormones. All right. So let's look up here at this particular section up here first. So we'll look at the ovarian cycle. So the ovarian cycle really is stimulated by follicle stimulating hormone. So you get one of these primordial follicles that develops into a primary follicle, and then a secondary follicle, eventually into a mature follicle. So that's what follicle stimulating hormone does. As these follicular cells develop, they're going to make sure that estrogen increases in concentration in the body. So mid-cycle, you have luteinizing hormone that's going to cause ovulation to occur. So that's at about day 14-ish. And then once the follicle has been ovulated, the follicular cells will turn into the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is going to be responsible for the increase in estrogens and progesterones that you see in this graph down here. Now notice that as that continues to move forward, you get a regression of the corpus luteum, and you get the corpus albicans, which is a disintegration of this tissue, and you get a decrease in these hormone levels of estrogen and progesterone. Okay, so that's kind of like the ovarian cycle over the course of 28 days. Now let's look at the uterine cycle down here. So at day 1 to day 3, you get the shedding of the endometrium, the inner lining of the uterus, the functionalis layer. You then have estrogens being increased in number and progesterones on the increase. These hormones, especially right here, estrogen, is going to stimulate the thickening of the inner lining of the uterus. Estrogen stimulates cell growth. So as this continues and progresses forward, as you have the corpus luteum pumping out, progesterone, which is the green graph, that's going to sustain this inner lining and keep that inner lining intact. Now, if the corpus luteum turns into the corpus albicans, you have a decrease in these hormones, and when these hormones decrease really quickly, it causes the shedding. So that endometrium cannot be sustained without the hormones in place. Okay, so you have that shedding. Now, if let's say that at day 14 intercourse happens and the embryo implants into the endometrium, the baby will begin to produce human chorionic HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin, and that's a hormone that's going to basically sustain the corpus luteum so that you can sustain the hormone levels until the placenta is formed and produces its own hormones. So without human chorionic gonadotropin, that inner lining of the uterus will not be sustained. If the embryo does not produce human chorionic gonadotropin, there will be a shedding event and the embryo will be lost. Okay, so you may need to pause the video just look at this and get a sense of what's occurring. Again, I look at it as like, this is the ovarian events that occur during the menstrual cycle. These are the uterine events that occur. And then these are all the hormones that are involved in regulating those particular cycles. There's lots of graphics you can look at in various books. This one right here is showing you gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, stimulating the release of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the follicles to grow. It stimulates estrogens to be produced. Luteinizing hormone will stimulate ovulation and stimulate the corpus luteum to secrete progesterone and estrogens. Then the corpus luteum, of course, produces progesterone and estrogens, which sustain and grow the inner lining of the uterus. Okay, and there's all kinds of feedback loops here too that will be negative feedback loops controlling the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. Again, you can look at all the graphics in the world, but I like this one because it ties in all the hormones coming from the hypothalamus and then the anterior pituitary with their jobs they perform. And then it shows you the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle, which is kind of interesting. So remember that here's day 14 right here, here's mid-cycle. So at the very beginning you get the shedding, and then as these cells produce the estrogens, you get a proliferative phase where those cells grow in number and the secretory glands grow in number. So at day 14 you get ovulation. So once the corpus luteum is formed, progesterone and estrogen stimulate the growth of the endometrium even more, and you go into a secretory phase where they're secreting secretions that will nourish and sustain the embryo. And then if the corpus albicans form, you get a decrease in those hormones, and menstruation will begin again. Now, menopause is going to happen around middle age, and this is when the cycles will cease, the menstrual cycle will cease. And the cause of menopause is aging of the ovaries, when the follicles no longer mature and estrogen levels are going to decline. All right, let's talk about mammary glands for a minute. Mammary glands are accessory organs that are specialized to secrete and to produce milk so that the baby can be sustained after it's born. Mammary glands are modified sweat glands. They're located within each of the breasts. Now, a mammary gland contains about 15 to 30 lobes. They're a dense connective tissue that separate the lobes, but the mammary glands themselves are epithelial in origin. Each lobe has lobules containing milk-secreting glands called alveoli, and each breast has a nipple containing lactiferous ducts where the milk will emerge out of the glands. The nipples are surrounded by a pigmented skin called the areola, which is kind of like a pigmented spot that the baby can recognize where the milk will be coming from. And this is what they look like. So you can kind of see the breast tissue is this kind of pinkish. Here's the fat tissue surrounding and aiding and protecting those particular tissue. You can see the lactiferous ducts leading to the nipple, and the areola is the pigmented spot around the outer edge. Now, the reason that females probably get breast cancer is because if you remember back to earlier lectures, we talked about many cancers forming in epithelial tissues. These are epithelial tissues. They do divide a lot, and therefore sometimes they are stimulated to grow. They get errors in the DNA, mutations in the DNA because of cell division, and they will cause breast cancer to form. So a mastectomy is the removal of the breast that has the cancerous growths. All right. So contraception, there are many methods of contraception. There are behavioral methods, so abstinence. Coitus interruptus is where the male will withdraw the penis before ejaculation occurs. The rhythm method is temporary abstinence during ovulation. Now, the trick of nature is that it wants you to get pregnant, so rhythm method is not necessarily the best method. Neither is coitus interruptus, because there are sperm cells that potentially have made their way down the vas deferens into the urethra. So abstinence is the only way you can prevent pregnancy 100%. There are surgical methods. So surgical methods don't include the condom. That's not really a surgical method. Forget about that. Sorry about that. But vasectomy and tubal ligation are methods of birth control. Vasectomy is where you cut the vas deferens and ligate it and seal it up. And tubal ligation is where you cut and then ligate or seal up the fallopian tubes. So there are non-incisional sterilization methods. So there is a micro-inset coil made of plastic and metals can be inserted into uterine tubes. This causes the growth of scar tissue in the uterine tubes and thus blocks the tubes from the transmission of eggs to the uterus. Here we have condoms. Condoms are barrier methods. So you have a male condom, female condom. Those prevent the sperm cells from moving to the vaginal canal. They also reduce the incidence of sexually transmitted infections. So there's a barrier method called the diaphragm and cervical cap. These are devices that are put into the female's vagina and they cover over the cervix, thus blocking or creating a barrier so sperm cells can't get to the uterus. So an IUD is an intrauterine device. There are several different types. One type works by blocking sperm from entering the uterine tubes, and it looks something like this. So this device is inserted in through the cervix into the uterus, and it basically blocks the sperm cells from going to the uterine tubes. There are chemical methods. So the birth control pill, there's all different kinds of types that work in different kinds of ways. But one type is one that comes with 28 tablets. So it's you take one tablet each day for 28 days. The first 20 to 21 tablets have small quantities of estrogen and progestins, and they stimulate the inner lining of the uterus to be maintained. And they also, because they're estrogens and progesterones, they simulate pregnancy. So typically there won't be a mid-surge cycle of luteinizing hormone. There won't be ovulation because the body thinks that it's pregnant. The last tablets are going to be hormone-free. They're typically sugar pills, and they are tablets that females take to make sure that she stays in the habit of taking the tablet each day. These sugar pills are no hormones, so they basically call for a reduced amount of hormone, and that basically reduced amount of hormone is going to cause the shedding of the inner lining of the uterus and cause a menstrual flow to occur. Okay, these hormones though are designed to not allow the ovarian follicles to develop and also not allow ovulation to occur. So spermicides, the Noxil 9 is used alongside a barrier method such as a sponge, a condom, diaphragm, or cervical caps, and this will kill sperm cells. And this just shows you a chart of some of the failure rates. So perfect use, failure rates, and then typical use, failure rates, percentages. Notice complete abstinence is the only fail-safe method. But you can look at the other methods there. You can just kind of stop the video and look at those to see. Percentage-wise, they do a pretty good job though if you utilize some kind of birth control pill. Emergency contraception doesn't look like it has a high rate of success though. So be responsible. And these are just failure rates for other devices as well. Notice that no method is going to leave you probably pregnant. There's a very high probability that you will become pregnant. So that's not a good family planning method. All right, sexually transmitted infections is my last thing I want to talk about. So, and I don't talk about this to scare you. I just talk about this to make you aware of what's out there. Gonorrhea, syphilis, chlamydia, these are the big three bacterial sexually transmitted infections. These can be acquired by not using a barrier method like the female or male condom. All the other methods, although you may not get pregnant, you can be susceptible to getting or acquiring these bacterial infections. All of these are treated with antibiotics, but we do have to caution the overuse of antibiotics and the creation of resistant forms of these particular bacterial infections. There are protistal organisms that, like trichomoniasis, is caused by Trichomonas vaginalis, and these are doing very well. They're very common. A lot of times they're asymptomatic in males and symptomatic in females. Of course, there is the human papillomavirus and the human herpes virus. These can cause genital warts or genital herpes, and also cervical cancer for human papillomavirus. Remember, we have a vaccine for that human papillomavirus, and I definitely encourage you to acquire that vaccine. Okay, so that finishes up the human reproductive system. In our next and last video, we will go into human development, one of my absolute favorite topics, because it's absolutely amazing how a human develops from a single cell. So until then, I will see you next time.